There are two ways to teach reading. Students can be taught to read phonetically or by sight. Traditionally, students were taught to read phonetically. Letters are symbols for sounds, and the sounds of the letters combine to form words. However, another method of teaching reading came into use in the early 19th century. This method calls for teaching students to recognize whole words by sight. Some attribute the development of this method to Thomas Gallaudet around 1830. Gallaudet worked with deaf children, and this method makes sense for teaching them as they can't recognize sounds. Others attribute the development of the method to John Russell Webb, who promoted the method through his New Word Primer. Regardless, the method caught on in teachers' colleges and educational journals, and by the 1950s it was the most popular way to teach reading in the United States. Books like Fun with Dick and Jane were designed to teach reading by this sight word method. These books used a limited vocabulary with designed repetition of words. In the 1930s and 1940s, Dr. Edward Dolch developed a list of high-frequency words. Today, these words are often taught as sight vocabulary. And in 1957, Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss himself, was hired to write a book using Dolch's limited vocabulary. In 1957, that book, The Cat in the Hat, was first published. In the 100-odd years, from Gallaudet to Dr. Seuss, many students were taught to read with this sight word method, but many of those students struggled to read. Traditionalists had opposed teaching reading by sight from the beginning, and in 1955, Rudolph Flesch wrote Why Johnny Can't Read, attacking the sight word method and defending phonics as the way to teach reading. Now, Flesch didn't argue for a complicated phonetics, but a simple phonics where students are taught to read from left to right by sounding out letters or groups of letters that make certain sounds. He wrote, "Those who believed in teaching reading by the phonetic method invented a way of doing it without using any special symbols or special terminology." Now, Flesch knew that teaching English with the phonetic method presented some difficulties. English has words that don't follow simple phonetic rules. However, most of the language is indeed phonetic. Again, Flesch wrote, "All alphabetic systems are phonetic. The two words mean the same thing. The only trouble is that English is a little more irregular than other languages." Now, Flesch pointed out that when a student is taught to read with phonics, he can read any word. But he noted that teaching students to read by sight at all cause certain problems. For example, students taught to read by the sight word method often confuse words like Austria and Australia. From a sight word method, this makes sense as the two words look similar as a whole. Teaching the sight word method teaches the students to read without actually looking at the letters, merely seeing general shapes and guessing at the words. A student taught to read by sight might guess Australia for Austria. But for a student taught to read phonetically, reading from left to right, one of these words obviously has an L in it. Flesch observed, "Memorizing or guessing the meaning of whole words is not reading. On the contrary, it is an acquired bad habit that stands in the way of your child's ever learning to read properly." Now, students that are taught to read phonetically and by sight might still have this problem. I have a daughter. She just finished first grade last year. And during the year, she was having trouble. She was studying for a spelling test from a sight word list that she had, and she was confusing the words then and than. This bothered me. I had taught her to read phonetically before she started school, and I knew that she could read those words. However, she was confusing them. She was guessing then for than. Why was she doing this? Because that's what teaching her sight words had taught her to do, to see a general shape and guess at the word. Now, when she was doing this, I told her to look at the word again, to look at it from left to right, and to sound it out. And she could read then and than with no problem. The reason she was having trouble was because of the method that she was taught. So, why did teaching reading by sight become so popular? When students are taught to read with this sight word method, they can often read simple books like Fun with Dick and Jane or The Cat in the Hat at an earlier age. Again, I go to Flesh, who wrote, more rapid results are generally obtained by the direct method of simply showing the word to the child and telling him what it is. However, he goes on to note, if you don't teach a child the letters, he'll always be stumped when he sees a new word. In short, there are two ways to teach reading. Students can be taught to read phonetically, or by sight, or by some combination thereof. However, only one of these methods really teaches children to read. Phonics. Systematic phonics is the way to teach reading. If you're a parent, teach your child to read with phonics. If you're a kindergarten or a first grade teacher, teach your students to read phonetically and don't teach them to read whole words by sight. You can still teach sight words, but teach them to read them phonetically. There are some exceptions that don't follow those rules. We'll talk about that in a later video, but for the most part, if a word can be read phonetically, a student should be taught to read that word phonetically. If you have students in upper grades that are struggling to read, take your time, go back, teach them phonics. If you tutor students that are struggling to read, teach them with phonics. If you work with adults that have difficulty with reading, teach them phonics. In short, if you really want to teach someone to read, teach them phonics.